Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Laura Ciceri.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Laura Ciceri, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights. And this podcast is designed for supply chain leaders who's on the go but want to be in the know. It allows people to be connected as they travel and manage global supply chains. Today, I am continuing in the series of What Would I Tell My 25-year-old self? This series is designed to help people think about their careers and to think about the management of self and the evolution of supply chain careers. Things don't always go as planned, and sometimes they're not easy. Today, I feel very fortunate. Keith Harrison. I have lots of respect for Keith for being best people that I've ever seen in building supply chain professionals, teams, and individuals to do outstanding work. Keith managed the supply area of Procter& Gamble for many years, and I am, without further ado, going to let Keith tell you a little bit about his career. Keith, tell the group about yourself.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Well, I'm a graduate of Duke University, an engineer, mechanical engineer. I spent 41 years with Procter & Gamble. I had a variety of assignments over the course of my career, multiple plant assignments. I spent 3 years in advertising. I was a general manager, lived in 4 different countries, spent 16 years in Europe over the course of that time. Spent my last 10 years of my career as the global supply chain officer for P&G, and one of the greatest assignments I've ever had.
Supply chain changed a lot in your life. It's fun. Let's think back to 25 years, 25-year-old Keith. Tell us what Keith was doing and where his head was at.
Well, when I was 25 years old, I was in Sheboygan, Michigan, and I was on my third first level assignment. I had started in Mahoupany, Pennsylvania, went out to Modesto, California, where we were building a new diaper factory. So I was part of a plant startup. And the company then asked me to take an HR assignment in Sheboygan, Michigan, which was one of our most difficult in terms of career at that point in time. I actually thought that if I could have 3 weeks of vacation and make $25,000 a year, that would be pretty good. So long-term career management or thinking really wasn't part of my mindset back then.
Yeah. But let's think back. If you were going to have a conversation with Keith at 25, what would you tell him?
I think there's several things that looking back, I would say first, don't be focused on hierarchical progression, but really work on broadening your skills and preparing yourself for the future, because at least I tend to think about, and P&G tended to think about things in terms of a career. And so over the course of a 35 or 40 year career, 1 or 2 years doesn't really make that much difference, and actually can pay big dividends if you acquire some skills or some experiences that will serve you well later. The other thing I would say would be to focus on learning how to communicate and communicate well. I spent 3 years in advertising over the course of my career. It wasn't something I asked to do. It was something the company asked me to do. But one of the benefits of that assignment, there were a number of benefits of that assignment, but one of the benefits of the assignment was learning how to communicate, not only verbally, which supply chain people tend to do pretty well because we manage large organizations and that's what we do, but also in writing. P&G had the famous one-page memo. And so I really learned how to manage my written communications. And the higher you go in the organization, the more important that becomes. Now, in today's world with AI and whatnot, that may maybe less important, but at least in my life, that was important. The other thing I would ask people to think about is think about the characteristics of assignments that you would want to have and not focus on a specific job. Your hierarchy knows more about opportunities in the company than you do. And so there may be opportunities out there that you can't see, but would be terrific for you. And so be sure your management understands what what you want to do. And the other thing I would say is recognize that things, and you said it, things almost never go to plan. And so try to keep yourself flexible and open. And I mean, not only in your mind, but in your geography, because opportunities present themselves, and you need to be prepared for the unusual. For example, when I was ready for my first plant manager assignment, I think the company's plan was for me to go to Missouri. But while I was waiting for it hadn't even been announced, the plant manager in Germany was killed in a car wreck.
Oh, no.
And the company needed a plant manager quickly that had diaper experience. I never really wanted to go international. My wife did, but I never really wanted an international assignment, but I wanted to be a plant manager. And I took it. And it was never part of my plan. It was never part of what I articulated doing. That international experience was a game changer for me, not only in terms of personal growth, but also in terms of learning that I loved living abroad. That was the start of what ended up being 16 years and 4 countries. So I could have turned that down. I don't think you and I would be talking right now had I done that, because I think that opened up a whole different pathway for me in terms of broadening and experience and whatnot that led me to where I finally ended up. So I think those things would be things I would ask young managers to think about. And I come back to your point, just recognize that whatever your plan is probably won't happen. All right. That doesn't say that whatever your goal is won't happen, but probably whatever your plan is won't happen.
I love your thought around the characteristics of the career and the management of the career. And a lot of people tell me that, they're looking for a job, and I tell them to go to Starbucks with a notebook and to write down the characteristics of the job or the career that they want. And I don't think people have really thought about the characteristics of the career. What was important to you, Keith?
I like leading organizations. I enjoy being around technology. All right. I'm an engineer. I appreciate technology. But what I really like is developing strategies, communicating those, seeing how the organization responds to that, seeing a group of people come together to achieve some pretty cool results. And Laura, you and I were working together back then. We were doing some pretty neat stuff at Procter back then. And I like having my organization be clear in its contribution to the business and the success of the company. And so I aspired to be in those kinds of roles. And so I was more of a people leader, if you will, than a technology leader. And don't get me wrong, technology leaders, quality leaders, purchasing leaders, those are all critical things. But what I really like to do was be the sort of the orchestra leader, if you will, and watch that play out.
And what skills did you need to develop to do that?
Good question. I think one of the skills you need to have in that kind of situation is you need to be able to coach people, manage people, but let them go off and get their results in somewhat their own way. So, that I had, especially in my last assignment, I had an incredible team, about half of which went on to lead global supply chains at other companies when they didn't replace me. All those people were strong leaders with their own styles. And so part of what I needed to do was to be able to provide input, provide coaching, provide direction, but recognize that these were talented people and they needed to be able to go get results in their own ways, consistent with what we needed to do, obviously as a supply chain and as a company. The other thing I think is important, for me at least, is the ability to communicate over distance. The larger your organization, the less one-on-one time you have with people. And that's even true at a plant manager kind of role. When you think about it, you come in, you're managing a group at the entry level, you're with those people 8 hours, 10 hours a day. And the higher you go in the organization, the less time you have to do that communication one-on-one or directly. And so I think the ability to communicate in ways that people get and understand and are energized or want to follow is a critical skill, and it becomes more critical the more senior you become in an organization. And part of that communication plan, in my view, is the ability to communicate clearly, but also in a pretty simple way. So you don't need a decoder ring, if you will, to understand what's going on. I think A.G. Lafley was a master at taking complex ideas and making them intuitive and simple. And I think that's a critical skill as well. So I think I try to focus on those kinds of things. The other thing I tried to do was put people in assignments that were growthful. And there was a number of times where I would have a conversation with somebody and I would basically tell them I needed them to go do this assignment. It wasn't necessarily in their plan. In a couple of cases, it really wasn't even something that they wanted to do. And sometimes you take one for the team, if you will, because we needed it. But almost inevitably, people would come back and thank me for having done that, because again, it broadened them, and so not only were we meeting a business need, but it was giving them a set of skills and experiences that they didn't have. So I think those would probably be the things that would come to mind immediately for me.
Keith, I give thanks that Procter&Gamble picked me up as a summer intern and started me on my career with really some great training and, culture. And, I'll be 71, but I didn't hear the term supply chain till about 1982. And I would have never have imagined the career of supply chain. I started out in manufacturing right at the Jackson plant, and then I worked at Winton Hill in R&D. But the whole area of supply chain sort of unfolded, right? Talk to me about, the evolution of supply chain for you, because you came from a deep manufacturing base, right?
Yep. I spent my first 10 years at the company in factories, all right? First level to plant manager in Germany. I think P&G was in many ways is an innovator, and we all talk about innovation in terms of product innovation and whatnot, but P&G also is an organizational innovator, and I believe, somebody can probably prove me wrong, but I believe that P&G originated the idea of product supply. And that, in my experience, started actually in Europe, where we combined the various elements of the supply chain into a single organization. And that was working well, and we adopted that in the United States probably about mid-'80s, as I remember it. So, and now product supply is you see it more than me, is a pretty common term out there now, and other organizations even use that exact term and titling and whatnot. But I think P&G recognized pretty early that bringing the disparate elements of purchasing and engineering, up to the mid 80s, we had a purchasing leadership and we had a manufacturing leadership and we had an engineering leadership, and they reported they weren't under a common organization structure, right? And I think P&G was early to recognize that drawing that horizontally could bring huge dividends. And so I was in a right position. I became the first product supply manager for the laundry business in North America in 1987. And that's really, from that point on, from 87 to my retirement, I was then working in product supply. Prior to that, I was working in manufacturing, right, with no connection at all to engineering or quality or purchasing. They were off doing their thing, and we were running plants.
There's a lot of beauty to those horizontal processes. And sometimes when organizations have strong leadership in one of those disciplines, it's hard for them to balance to be able to manage the greater whole. And so the transformation from that very functional orientation to more of a horizontal must have been hard.
There's no doubt that those early years were difficult. And so suddenly you have a pretty senior engineering leader working for the vice president of engineering, and now that individual is going to be working for a product supply leader. And you got into all these arguments about, well, they can't appreciate my technology skills, or they can't appreciate my purchasing skills, or manufacturing folks, if we ever had a purchasing leader do it. We went through that. But one of the things that we did very intentionally when I was there, and I think it's still going on, is we designed a career path for aspiring leaders that required them to have experiences across the supply chain. So you could not be a band 4 when I was leading the organization. You could not be a band 4 unless you'd had more than one discipline in the supply chain. So if you were if you were coming out of the plants, you had to do a customer service role or a purchasing role, or most of our manufacturing people were engineers, or an engineering role. Same thing with purchasing and engineering and whatnot. So we were working very hard to have that cross-pollination, if you will, so you could have, I always felt that you were a better purchasing person if you were actually having to run in a factory the stuff that you were buying, all right? Because sometimes the lowest cost on the individual purchase price doesn't mean the lowest cost at the end of the day if the scrap rates are high or whatever. So I always felt that was a good thing. My leadership team fully endorsed it. That was one. Then our other thing was, we always said, if you could not be a vice president in product supply unless you'd had an international experience. So we were really trying to, and you couldn't be a band 5 unless you'd had more than one business unit. So we were trying to, and that's why I say I came from a company where we were focused on talent development. We would track our managers, leaders in the organization, and what skill sets they had, what they needed for their next assignment. And we were very intentional when we went out and tried to provide those assignments, so that by the time people were ready for a more senior role, they had all the skills and experiences that we wanted to see. And I think that, back to where you started, I think that over time broke down some of these more parochial silos, if you will, inside the organization, because everybody was coming from much more of a common shared experience base.
Let's go back to communication. You did I think, a wonderful thing when you built that team that, unfortunately, not everybody could take your job, but they went and built great teams in other organizations because of what you built with talent. But when you talk about communication and you talk about building teams with communication, Let's talk about influence management at your peer level. How do you best represent the needs of the supply group? Because you actually had cross-functional experience at a higher leadership level with your advertising experience and your international experience. But, often I'll find people that are like, I just don't know how to talk to the board. I don't know how to talk to my manager, right? And I'm like, you don't talk in acronyms and you don't talk like you're a victim or a whiner. How do you best influence people to understand supply?
Well, first, I think you need to understand, this is true of everything, you need to understand the customer. All right.
Uh-huh.
So, one of the things that I was always told was a strength was I spoke the business language. Okay. So, in my peer group, I was the only supply person. So, what was my peer group interested in? They were interested in commercial results. All right. And so we would try to have our conversations around how the supply chain or the supply organization was meeting their needs, which were generally speaking cash and profit and sales. All right. But rather than talk about process reliability or that kind of stuff, eyes glaze over in the commercial world when you get to that, when you're talking about that stuff. We talk about how our work is lowering their cost or improving their response times, or the kind of language that they would mean. That what that means though is you need to educate yourself then on what the needs of the people you're interacting with are, and then be able to translate the metrics of your organization into things that are relevant to them, right? And if you can't do that, then it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation. If you can, and we certainly have seen that in spades during the COVID situation, where supply chains really, I'd like to think we were doing some really neat stuff when I was there, but supply chains really came to the fore then because it was an existential threat to the company if we
Mhm.
couldn't make and ship. But I think trying to be able to make that simple translation into the needs of your peer group or your customers is key. We always try to talk about how we build sales by things like response time. All right, and we are reducing out of stocks. We want to reduce out of stocks because those are missed sales. All right. Okay. The metric's out of stock, but the important thing is sales. Okay. Same with customer service. We're missing sales. So are scrap rates. That scrap's fine, but that's a cost. That's lost profit. So I think trying to really get it in the language of your whoever you're trying to interface with is key, and you said it, get out of the jargon. I mean, we have supply chain and probably everything, but supply chain has so many acronyms and all this other stuff. And I get it. When you're in there, it shorthands it. It makes it easy for everybody to understand. But when you're not part of that, your eyes glaze over, right? And you don't want that.
You talked about AJ Lafley being just brilliant at translation of complex to simple, and I love his moments of truth.
Yep, that's the prime example.
Yep. Was the customer delighted and was it available? And it seems like that was a wonderful way to align, at a simple level. You know, as you think about aligning to those moments of truth, what did that do to your leadership team?
I'll give you an example of one where it was in the 2008 financial crisis. It was pretty clear that the company was going to have a tough go. And so my leadership team decided we needed to go do more than what we had in our budget. And so we decided we were going to go try to reduce costs by an extra $1 billion and improve cash by an extra $1 billion. And so we came up with this, and we came up with a plan, and everybody had their piece of that and whatnot. But we titled it 1 + 1 by 1.
Oh,
And so it was $1 billion in cost, $1 billion in cash by one united organization. And we deployed that across the entire global supply chain. Every plant had their piece of that. All right. Every time I would visit a plant, we would talk about what they're doing against that. We actually overshot it, and pretty substantially. But it was again that kind of simple metric that, and the company, we actually continued that for a couple more years. It was so powerful, but it was a kind of simple aligning thing that everybody could see and feel and get their part in and feel good about. We reported it like monthly, just for everybody. We had a global webcast, which back then was not all that. It certainly wasn't Zoom back then. That's for sure. So it was an audio. It was a global audio cast back then. It was a great aligning. Idea was sort of complex, but the communication was pretty simple, and everybody could remember it. Right?
yes.
Same thing with first and second moments of truth. That's a pretty complicated idea, but everybody gets it. As soon as you hear it, you know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think finding those kinds of, I'm not a linguist, but finding those kinds of, I'm an engineer, but finding those kinds of things, that's what good leaders do, is they find that simple way to hook people and bring everybody along.
Well, Keith, you've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate it. Anything you want to tell the audience about managing their career? We talked about characteristics. We talked about the fact that life zigs and zags. You don't know where things are going to go. Be open to opportunity. Anything else you'd like to add?
I guess the one thing I had the benefit of working for a company that I enjoyed and respected. And I had the benefit of being surrounded by people that I enjoyed. In fact, throughout my career, the bulk of my friends happened to be other P&G colleagues. But I will say, life's too short if you're not surrounded by people you like in a company that you like. You owe it to yourself to be with people and companies that you respect and enjoy. So you can pursue a great career in a lot of places. And this is not a job hopping advertisement. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, it is your career, and you need to be sure that the whole package is there, including the personal enjoyment and respect for the company and the people you're around. Other than that, I think we've covered pretty much everything I would offer up for people.
You know, what strikes me, Keith, as we talk about this is many people are in a job. Not all companies are as comprehensive in career management and talent development as P&G, but the individual can manage the career.
Yep.
If they're in the job, and they can, when they interview for another job, they can sense if they want to be with those people that they're working with, the characteristics, right? Getting back to the characteristics of what you want to do versus a job. So,
Well, Laura, I'll offer one more thought then that you just triggered. That is, there is an element of managing up. Okay. And I think individuals have to take responsibility at the end of the day for their own career. And you can work, even if you're in a company that's not as focused on this as Procter. I believe you can work with your manager and your leadership to help them help you create a career for yourself.
mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's a passive. In fact, it's definitely not passive. It's a very active thing that I think young leaders can can go out and proactively work with their manager to be sure they understand what they want to do, characteristics, and their goals, and to be sure we're all aligned that that makes sense and that your manager is going to help you get there.
And I think, Keith, to build on that, they're not cookie cutter, right? What's
Nope.
right for Laura might be different than Keith. And, I think, getting back to the characteristics, what I find is most people haven't thought about the characteristics that makes them successful, whether the kind of people, the kind of work. And I think that's really a gift that you've given us today. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much.
I appreciate all that you've done for Supply Chain, and I'll conclude this podcast. Thank you, Keith. Have a great day.
Thank you, Laura. Hello.